Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum is a monumental film, both narratively as a complex commentary on issues and trauma within Indigenous communities, as well as societally as a piece of phenomenal Indigenous filmmaking. Taking place in 1991 on the Red Crow Mi'kmaq Reservation in Canada, Blood Quantum introduces a new twist to zombie cult classics. Native Americans are the only ones that are immune to the zombie outbreak. Some of you may already be connecting the groundwork for the sort of commentary that'll be going on here, but we'll get to that. So what I would like to do with this video is sit down and analyze the intricacies of this film from the perspective of another Indigenous person. So consider this your obligatory spoiler warning, because I'm going to run through these aspects of the film with the assumption that you either have already seen the film or you are not concerned about me spoiling some of the major plot points of this film. The film centers around 6 main characters. We have Trailer, who is our main protagonist and the sheriff of the Red Crow Police Department. And once the zombie outbreak sort of takes over, he becomes the leader of our group of survivors, per se. We have Joss, who Trailer and Joss are not together romantically. However, they do have a son together and they do have sort of a co-parenting situation with him. That son being Joseph, one of our other main characters, who has a girlfriend, Charlie, and she is pregnant over the course of the movie. And then we have Trailer's other son and Joseph's half-brother, Lysol, as well as Gisigu, who is Trailer's father. The first topic that I would like to discuss in this movie is one that is a little more subtle, and it comes up pretty early on in the film. That topic being missing and murdered Indigenous women. So, early on in the film, we get this line of dialogue from Joseph.
He doesn't have anyone else. Trailer fucking abandoned him. The whole reserve knows what happened to his mom.
This line of dialogue stands out because it's not the only time in the film that Lysol's mother is brought up, and it's sort of insinuated that she is either dead or is no longer around for some other reason. And all the times that it's brought up, it's only brought up relatively vaguely. We're not given any details on what exactly has happened to Lysol's mother, but we know that something did happen to Lysol's mother. And that is something that is very familiar within Indigenous communities. The movement to bring awareness and an end to missing and murdered Indigenous women is something that has grown a lot more attention in recent years, but it is something that has been around and has plagued our communities for much, much longer. And the way that this film treats Lysol's mother mirrors the way that the United States and Canadian government treats its missing and murdered Indigenous women. We're given the details, we know that something has happened, and yet we are not given any sort of answer to this. And the fact that the film brings it up multiple times draws awareness to this. It makes you aware of the fact that something has happened to Lysol's mother more than just simple backstory for Lysol. It's brought up multiple times so you know. So it puts the question in your head of what happened to Lysol's mother? And the film deliberately doesn't give you an answer. The same way that we are not given answer time and time again by the people that are supposed to be getting them for us. So the way that this film takes what could have been simple backstory for Lysol's character and puts this extra layer of detail and reality for Native communities into it really just shows how interwoven the Native identity is in every single aspect of this film from start to finish. Intergenerational trauma is another significant theme of Blood Quantum, and while every character displays it in one way or another, I would like to focus specifically on Trailer and Lysol, as they are two characters that have arcs based around their trauma as well as how they are linked to each other. Later on in the film, it is told to us that Lysol had gone into foster care after what had happened to his mother, and that is a very significant trauma for him. Not only is there abandonment that he feels towards his mother, but also his father for him not stepping up and taking care of him after his mother was gone. Something else to note is that it is mentioned that when Lysol went into foster care, his name was Alan, and when he came out, his name was Lysol, which I had read as a subtle nod to the traumas that Lysol had gone through in foster care. There is a lot of trauma associated with foster care, especially foster care within Indigenous communities. So Lysol's trauma manifests itself in multiple different ways, the most blatant of which are his misogyny, his disdain towards Trailer, as well as his constant attempts to sever his relationship with Joseph. And with Trailer, Trailer is not very emotionally available as a father. And looking at the scenes that he shares with his father, it seems like that is something that he has picked up intergenerationally as well. At no point in this movie is there a line of dialogue from any father figure telling their son that they love them. When it comes to the relationship between Trailer and Lysol, Lysol clearly feels that Trailer has failed him as a father, and Trailer, feeling like a failure as a father, keeps them apart from each other.
Tell that to your brother. Whatever you think of me, the kid deserves better.
Better than what?
Either one of us.
Trailer's lack of attempts to mend the relationship between him and his son definitely makes Lysol feel as though Trailer sees him as a lost cause and little more. So combining Lysol's trauma with Trailer's trauma, we have Lysol's disdain keeping him away from having a healthy relationship with Trailer, and Trailer's unavailability keeping it that way. And it's important to note, when it comes to the emotional unavailability, it's something that is definitely common within Indigenous communities for a multitude of reasons. There is a lot of, especially when it comes to the historical traumas associated with things like boarding schools, and having generations of Indigenous children growing up with no parental figures and terrible abuse being done to them, that once those children are becoming parents, it's hard to learn how to be something that you never received or had any sort of example of when you were a child. The men in this film come off as aloof, but not because it's badass, but because of intergenerational trauma and hurt. Trailer and Lysol are victims of their shared trauma, and the fact that they are linked together is really driven home in a simple yet impactful way, which is the way that their death scenes are portrayed visually. Trailer and Lysol are given matching death scenes, both in the music as well as visually. They're both given a crane shot from above, looking down on them as they're consumed by the zombies. Our metaphor for colonization. Another strong point of this movie is the way that Jeff Barnaby uses the zombie film genre to really shine a light on the history of genocide and colonization, and how that history is embedded into the psyche of Indigenous communities to this day. There's an interview where Jeff Barnaby discusses the way that he wanted to use irony in this film, and how he wanted this film to have a very strong sense of irony in the way that things play out. And one example of this is their encampment, or should I say reservation. The irony being that, once again, Native people have been forced onto a reservation by white people. However, this time, the reservation serves to keep the white people outside rather than trapping the Native people inside. These moments of serendipitous irony are really what makes the medium of a zombie survival story a thought-provoking analogy for colonialism. There's a scene in the film where we really start to learn more about each individual character, especially Lysol, who I think has some of the most poignant lines in the film. The scene takes place at the gate of the camp where Lysol and one of his friends are guards. And Joseph, Charlie, and a few others are returning from a scavenging mission where we find out that they have picked up a couple of white survivors. These 3 survivors are a man, his daughter, and a woman named Lilith. And as soon as they arrive, Lysol is immediately hostile to all of them, and that tension only escalates when we find out that the daughter has been bitten. As this argument is escalating, it seems as though Charlie has told these survivors that the Native community is somehow able to cure bites, which goes to show that even though she is in a relationship with one of the Native members of the community and she is living inside this encampment, she still does not seem to have a grasp on what exactly is going on. So during this encounter, we get this really fantastic line of dialogue from Lysol.
Put her down.
What's going on here? I haven't done anything wrong.
You're bringing your sick here. What's right about it?
This is a clear reference to illnesses brought over by colonizers. Illnesses that Native American communities had no experience with and in turn cause widespread death. And while Lysol may be immune to this outbreak, he is very quick to call out the familiar actions of colonization. It is harsh, and while Joseph and Trailer may not agree with him, he is not unanimously wrong. And later on, the movie makes sure to emphasize that fact.
Get word round, Jay. This is clean. We got celebrating to do. Party at my place. Taking this gas from my fucking car. Hey!
Let him go,
Why?
because he's not wrong.
After all, Lilith lies about being bitten, infiltrates the camp, and endangers everybody there. Speaking of which, Lilith serves as the catalyst for the final act of the film. So what happens is Lysol tries to have sex with Lilith, who ends up turning into a zombie and biting his penis off. And it is graphic, and it may seem unnecessary, but as a metaphor for colonization's methods of destroying Native American communities, it is dead on. Lysol's ability to be a father has now been taken from him, essentially killing off an entire line of descendants right there. Lysol has been sterilized, and within indigenous communities, the history of forced sterilization is a very little talked about but very impactful method of mass genocide. In 1976, the US government had admitted that some of its Indian Health Services organizations had sterilized over 3,000 Native women in the years 1973 to 1976. That is over 3,000 women in 3 years being sterilized against their will. That is 3 years in the 1970s. And there is no telling just how many people that had been done to before. Another study done by Dr. Connie Pinkerton-Urie had shown that 1 in 4 Native women had been sterilized against their will. That is 25% of the population being unable to have children through no fault of their own, but rather through a system that is actively trying to erase a group of people. It is so much more than just one gory scene. It is a metaphor for a very dark piece of history. I would like to wrap up this analysis by talking about blood quantum. And I don't just mean the movie, I mean the concept of blood quantum within indigenous communities. Because the way that this film talks about the idea of blood quantum brings about some really complex and interesting discussion. So basically, for anybody who is unaware, blood quantum is the concept brought forth by the United States and Canadian governments to measure how native somebody is based upon the amount of native that their parents were, and their parents were, and their parents were. Basically, if you're the child of somebody who is 100% native and somebody that is 50% native, you would be considered 75% native. Or if you're a kid of somebody who is 75% native and 25% native, you would be 50% native. So it's basically taking indigenous identity and dividing it into fractions. And an important thing to note is that when I say measuring how native someone is, that is a little bit of a misinterpretation. Because realistically, the way that the Canadian and United States government used it was to determine how white you were, therefore how much of a human being you were, and if you were worthy of humane treatment. Not only is that a very important distinction, it is a very disturbing implication and is based entirely in the idea that being indigenous is akin to not even being a human being. The thing about blood quantum is that a lot of tribes and native communities are still using blood quantum to this day to measure out and determine who is and is not a tribal member. The use of blood quantum in tribes today to determine enrollment is a very long and complicated conversation. It is important to keep in mind that this is where this concept has come from. It has come from colonization, and it has come from being used as a tool aimed directly at a dwindling population of Native Americans to make sure that it only dwindles further. I will say that it is important to note that there are some Native Americans that stand behind the idea of blood quantum today, and there are many that think that it needs to be gone entirely. What I would like to talk about when it comes to the way that this film discusses blood quantum specifically has to do with the child of Charlie and Joseph. Charlie is pregnant, and there are a couple of different scenes in the film where she directly expresses concern about whether or not her and Joseph's child is going to be immune. Basically, she is concerned about the blood quantum of their child and if their child will be native enough to be immune to this virus. This is a very clever question to pose towards the audience. This, do you think their child will be native enough to be immune? However, the film does address this question in a relatively subtle way if you're paying attention. You see, Charlie is the only non-native main character in the entire film, and she is also the only one that is truly concerned about blood quantum. Everybody else tells her that the baby is going to be okay and that the baby will be immune. Even at the end of the film, after Charlie has been bitten and she's dying and she has given birth to the child, Joseph still tells her that the baby is safe and the baby is going to be immune. Ultimately, the reason for this is because blood quantum is little more than colonizer ideology, and it is a tool that's been used to perpetuate colonization and genocide. And so, blood quantum sends a very strong and clear message by having all of the characters act as though that is the status quo. All the characters conduct themselves in a way to say blood quantum is not going to matter when it comes to this child, because in a world where the only people immune to a virus are native people, this child is going to be a native person. And that is truly a beautiful and impactful message. So, thank you for sticking around until the end of this video. I hope that if you haven't watched it, that you go out and you watch this movie. Even if I've spoiled everything that's happened in it, I hope that this has inspired you to support this film and support more Indigenous filmmaking, because right now it is not a very large community, but I think it's something that needs to be heard and needs to be supported, and I would love to see it grow and see more and more great and unique stories being told from perspectives that are all too often overlooked. We know our stories, and you can't tell them for us. So support Indigenous filmmaking. Thank you for watching.